If you have a Bible this morning, go ahead and begin to turn to Matthew chapter 26. We'll be looking at that part of the story this morning. Today, as has already been mentioned, has become known as Palm Sunday, a day when the faithful remember, as you'll see in the next slide, Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem for the very last time. An entrance that was welcomed with great fanfare and celebration as the crowd on that day broke off branches and waved palm branches like they would for a military leader or a king that was returning from a victory on the battlefield. One of the first actions that Jesus takes as he enters the city of Jerusalem was to go to the temple, the place of worship. And there he took intentional and forceful action in turning the temple from a marketplace and a profit center and back into a place of prayer and worship as it was always intended. Now, after he does this, he leaves the city briefly, returning later with his disciples to participate in the Passover meal and all that it means. He says in one of the other Gospels that he eagerly longed to have this meal with the 12 apostles, knowing that it would be his last on planet Earth. Now, in John's account, you see this upper room experience beginning in John chapter 13, going all the way through John 17. And I would commend that portion of Scripture to you during Holy Week as a way of seeing the things and the sayings of Jesus in that upper room before he takes off to the Olive Garden. I think that would be good preparation. Now, this would not be just another meal or even another Passover meal, as special as that was, but it would be given new meaning by Jesus himself, with implications not only for the 12 apostles, but also implications for you and me this morning. We begin taking a look at this in Matthew 26, beginning in verse 17, where we see the preparations for this final meal beginning. Verse 17 says, "On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, 'Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?' And he replied, 'Go into the city to a certain man and tell him, the teacher says, my appointed time is near. I am going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house.'" How would you like that announcement, knowing that you maybe hadn't cleaned up recently? So the disciples did as Jesus directed them and prepared for the Passover. Now, the Jews every year celebrated 3 yearly feasts: the Feast of Pentecost, the Feast of Tabernacles, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or Passover. Each one of these feasts enabled them to remember God's faithfulness throughout their history, and therefore his continued faithfulness in their lives in the present and in the future. Now, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or the Feast of Passover, reminded the Hebrews and even others that participated about that time, 1,300 years earlier at that time. Now it's been 3,300 years earlier, when God came and rescued the Hebrews from captivity under the Egyptians. He passed over the Hebrew homes, but he brought punishment to the Egyptian homes. And then under Moses' leadership, he leads them out of Egypt on that long journey that finally brought them to the Promised Land. So every single year at this time, they would gather together and have this meal and this week that reminded them of that time in their history. You can read about it in detail, which I did this week, in Exodus chapter 12, Leviticus 23, and other places like that. Now, this account that we're reading this morning takes place on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, twilight on the 14th of April. They wanted to get it in right before tax season came to a close. Some of you just catching on to that. It's all right. It's okay. No, not a problem. Luke's account reveals that it's actually Peter and John who asked Jesus about Passover preparation and where it should take place. And he responds to their question by directing them where they're to go and what they're to say. In verse 18, he says, "Go to a certain man and tell him, the teacher says, my appointed time is near. I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house." And so they are to go out and look for a certain man carrying a water container. Now, there would have probably been a number of men carrying water containers, so it's quite probable that Jesus knew who this man was and described him, and this man was familiar with Jesus and maybe even with the rest of the apostles. He needs to find a place and someone that has a large enough house and a large enough guest room to be able to house the 12 for this feast they're going to be having. And it's also crystal clear that at this point Jesus understands beyond a shadow of a doubt that his time on earth is very quickly coming to an end. And so Peter and John do as directed. They find this certain man. They secure the location. Some believe that this was the home of John Mark. John Mark was the cousin of Barnabas. He was the one that in time would write what we know as the Gospel of Mark, and he was a traveling ministry team partner of the Apostle Peter. And so they go there, they make appropriate preparation for the Passover meal, which would have included securing the flattened or unleavened bread, bitter herbs, and the wine that was needed for this feast. Now, it also meant that they had to find a perfect lamb, one without blemish or spot. Then have the lamb sacrificed in the temple court, the blood of the animal put on the altar, and also there was a time where they would put it on their doorpost in remembrance of that time of the Exodus. The lamb would then be roasted whole, and when this was done, then the feast was ready to begin. And all of these things took place according to the prescription and the very specific instructions given in the Old Testament. And so it's at this time that Jesus and the rest of the disciples go to this location and begin to share in the Passover meal. And it is at this time and in the midst of this meal that Jesus reveals his betrayer. You read about it in verses 20 through 25, but we want to take a look at a brief video clip of what that might have been like. The Passover that they were participating in was eaten at night in April. At the time of the Passover, sundown in Jerusalem would come somewhere around 6 p.m., and so their meal would have begun right around this time or shortly after. They would gather around a U-shaped table similar to what you see there. Table fellowship in the Middle East, both then and now, is very intimate. It's highly relational. It's one of the most significant things that happens during their day. Now, for the Passover, it was required that at least 10 people would be necessary to celebrate the feast. So during this time, you would often have 2 or more families, kind of combining families together to do it. These guys didn't have to, as Jesus and the 12 on this night made up the family unit. The usual posture around the table would be laying out with your feet in front of you and leaning on your left arm, or reclining on couches, which would have been customary for times like these. And it's in the midst of this setting that with his 12 that Jesus introduces the idea of a betrayer. Now, the word betray means to give away or to turn over to another. Now, it can be used in a positive sense or in a negative sense. It depends upon the context. And clearly in this context, the word betray is not being used in a positive sense. Judas has already, before this meal, conspired to betray Jesus with the religious leaders, the chief priests of that day. And so when Jesus says that one of you will betray me, he's really saying one of you around this table who has been with me from the beginning, One of you that's traveled with me for 3.5 years. One of you who has had a front row seat. One of you who has been on the receiving end of my teaching, my miraculous works, my love and care, my training, my discipleship. You are the one that is now going to betray God's Messiah. You are going to betray the one and only Son of God. His words produce immediate sadness and personal self-examination within the group of disciples around the table at that time, causing them to ask this question: is it I, Lord? And the way that sentence is put together, they're clearly assuming that the answer is, of course it's not you, Peter. Of course it's not you, John. Of course it's not you, Andrew. But they're asking him a very important question. Right after that, Jesus goes on to identify who the betrayer is. He says, it's the one who dips in the bowl with me. Now, the bowl would have been a sauce that was made up of nuts and raisins and dates and figs and vinegar that you would dip the unleavened or flattened bread into to give it some moisture and some taste. He says, the one around the table that dips into this bowl with me, that is the one who is going to betray me. Now, it's quite probable and quite likely that Judas was sitting very close to Jesus. The Apostle John sitting on one side and Judas sitting on the other side. Sitting close like that was a place of honor. It was a place of trust. It was a place of respect. In fact, in John's account, when Jesus says, one of you will betray me, Peter looks at John, who's sitting next to Jesus, and says, hey, John, why don't you ask him who this is? Peter had put his foot in his mouth so many times, he wanted John to be the one this time, I guess. I don't know what it was. But John was up close, and he wanted John to nestle in and kind of find out for him. You see, this would have been absolutely abhorrent that an honored guest at a feast like this, and especially the Passover feast, would have the nerve and the gall to betray his host. It would have been the worst of the worst. It would be like a spouse today betraying the other spouse, a close friend betraying another close friend, a confidant betraying the one who entrusted them with things, the chief of staff of the president betraying the very president of the United States. It would have been that caustic and that repulsive at that time. Hundreds of years earlier, the psalmist in Psalm 41:9, certainly talking about what he had experienced, but with a forward look to this time, said, even my close friend, whom I trusted, he who shared my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. The psalmist recounting the fact that even in his own circle, there were those that were trying to take him out. And certainly this applies, doesn't it, around the table with Jesus and the one that would betray him. You see, we see in this story also the mystery of the sovereignty of God working in conjunction with the free will of a human being. When Jesus says the Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. In other words, what the Holy Scriptures have said in the Old Testament, maybe even thinking of Isaiah 53, what has been written about the Messiah will be as it was written. God's plan will fulfill itself. But then he goes on, he says, but woe to the man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better if he was not born. And so he indicates on the one side what God has predetermined is going to take place, but he also does not excuse or let go free the fact that this guy made a personal decision. He exercised his free will in betraying Jesus to the chief priests. You have the sovereignty of God and the free will of man working mysteriously in conjunction with one another at this table. See, after Jesus says that, Judas says, "Surely, not I, Rabbi." Jesus says, "Yes, it is you." The other said, "Surely is not I, Lord." Judas says, "Surely it is not I, Rabbi," teacher. He doesn't address Jesus in the same way that everybody else around the table addressed him. He addresses him as a rabbi, which is true. And I wondered this week, do we have in this statement, in this question, something revealed about the heart of this man, that after 3.5 years, he was still looking at Jesus as simply a good teacher, maybe even the best teacher of all the rabbis he knew. But he had not yet come to a place where he saw him as Lord, as King, as the sovereign one. I mean, how many today is that true for? They see Jesus as a great guy. He's a wonderful teacher. He has good words about how to have a good marriage and how to do this and how to do that, but they haven't yet surrendered to him as the Lord and sovereign and ruler over their life. Could be some of us that are here today that find ourselves in the same place. Maybe you're saying, "Well, I'm not planning to betray Jesus." I'm not talking about that right now. I'm talking about the difference between seeing him as another teacher and seeing him as the Lord of the universe. It might be an insight into some of the issues that were going on inside of Judas. In John's account, in John 13, it says that Jesus gave him the bread. It says at that point, Satan entered him, literally, was controlling and empowering his next steps. Jesus tells Judas, "Hey, Judas, what you're going to do, get it on, do it quickly, time to go." And Judas then leaves the room. John tells us none of the other disciples understood the conversation and the back and forth that was going on between Jesus and Judas. In fact, it says the disciples thought that Jesus was sending Judas to the grocery store. Go get some more herbs, go get some more wine, go get some more bread. They didn't know what was going on. Maybe it was beyond their imagination that any of the 12 would possibly be the betrayer. Judas was the money keeper. He was the treasurer. He had a huge responsibility among the 12. A lot of times we look at Judas as just the guy that betrayed and hung himself. But for 3.5 years, he was one of the guys that was in tight and close. And he ended up being the very one who betrayed. So Jesus and the 11 now, as our story progresses, they're the ones that are left in this room as Judas has departed. And it's at this point in the evening that Jesus turns this very special and important Passover meal, and he actually elevates the significance and the importance of it. In verse 26 and following, it says, "While they were eating, Jesus took bread, he gave thanks, and he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples, saying, 'Take and eat, this is my body.' And then he took the cup, giving thanks and offering it to them, saying, 'Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant.'" Many later translations, it says New Covenant, maybe the Bible you're reading out of, "which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink of the fruit of this vine from now on until the day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom." And then they sung a hymn, one of the Hallel Psalms of Psalm 113 to 118, and then they went out to the Mount of Olives. Now, I want to make just a couple of comments on this before we celebrate the Lord's Supper too, but one of the things I want you to see just in these verses that Jesus obviously is taking the bread and he's telling them that it is way more significant now than it was up to this point, and he's taking the cup. and he's saying it's way more significant now than it ever was. But he's also talking about the future. It's at this Passover meal that he says, there is a time coming and a kingdom coming when everything is wrapped up here, and I want you to be futuristic in how you live your life and how you look. Every time you do the Lord's Supper, which we'll do in a minute, I want you to remember the significance of my sacrifice, but I also want you to look ahead to another day when I am reigning supreme in a new heaven and a new earth. So Jesus takes two of the common elements at the Passover meal and gives them new meaning and significance. No longer simply a reminder of God's past activity during the Exodus, but now his current rescue plan through his own Son. The flattened or unleavened bread takes on new meaning during the Passover meal. When Jesus takes it, breaks it, he offers thanks and gives it to the disciples, saying, take and eat, this is my body. And so the flattened, unleavened bread that up to this point had reminded the Hebrews every Passover of how quickly they had to leave their house. They couldn't even put yeast in the dough. They just had to take off. Now becomes symbolic of the body of their Messiah, the Son of God. Maybe they remembered John the Baptist, the beginning of Jesus' ministry, saying, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. There were traditionally 4 cups of wine at the Passover feast. The drinking of each cup related to remembering one of the 4 promises found in Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 and 7. Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper between the 3rd and the 4th cup. And the 3rd cup of wine now becomes symbolic of the shed blood of the Messiah, the Son of God, for the forgiveness of sins, not just for the Jews, but for the entire world. It's so significant that Jesus says, I make a vow right now that I will not drink wine until the coming of the future kingdom. And so at this meal, where they would normally drink the 4th cup, he abstains, and most likely his apostles do as well, from drinking that 4th cup. Jewish tradition, along with the Old Testament scriptures, portrayed the time of this coming kingdom as a huge banquet. Isaiah 25:6, Matthew 8:11, where the Bible promises this unending supply of wine and food and celebration. You read about that in Amos chapter 9, verses 13 and 14 in the Old Testament. So Jesus and his 11 disciples are left in this upper room in the city of Jerusalem. They sing one of the psalms between Psalm 113 and 118, and then it says that they leave the room and they take the short 15-minute walk to the Olive Garden known as Gethsemane, where the story continues, and where the story continues for us as we look forward to coming together again on Good Friday. We're going to celebrate this meal, the Lord's Supper, communion, this morning. The servers can begin to make their way. If you're a believer in Jesus Christ, you believe that he is not only the Messiah, but he's your Messiah, that he didn't just come to forgive some, but he came to forgive you, then we would invite you to participate with us this morning. As you get the little piece of bread and the cup in your hands, I'd like you to do a couple of things as we meditate together. I certainly want you to remember the difference that his sacrifice has made for you, his broken body and his shed blood. I'd also like you to think futuristic a little bit as he talks in here about the fact that there is a coming kingdom, that everything is not what we're experiencing in these few short years that we have on the planet. There is a whole nother celebration that God has planned for us. So remember what it means for you in the here and now. but would you take some time this morning to also think about that day when you're with him in a whole nother realm, in a whole nother place, celebrating everything that he's done with every person from every tribe and tongue and nation. I think that's a pretty cool thought. And then I'd like you just to listen to the words of this song that will be sung. I think it will help you to meditate and to ponder the things that we've talked about this morning. Let me just encourage you, remind you that we continue during Passion Week as a church, as do all churches, remembering those final days and those last hours. I would urge you as an individual or as a family, whether you take one of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or whether you go to John's Gospel, and every day read a little something about Jesus' march towards the cross. And then on this Friday, Good Friday service, we'll be remembering exactly that, I think in some ways that are going to really be significant and meaningful to you and to the friends that you'll bring with you. And then on Sunday, we turn the corner and it's high celebration time as we remember the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But the resurrection of Jesus Christ is more meaningful as we remember what happened during that last week, isn't it? We remember what he had to go through before he escaped the grave. I want to encourage us to invite our friends. This is a season of the year when people who don't normally attend a church service will come on the arm of a friend, and I hope that we have those, and we've definitely got those arms, and so let's bring them. I also want to say to those of you that are visiting with us just how much we appreciate every week having folks that come and visit with us and check things out. And you come because you're looking for a church, you come for a whole lot of reasons, and we're just glad that you did. And I just want to remind you when you leave the visitors area, guest reception out on the west exit just to your left, where there'll be some people there that have a gift for you if you're visiting with us. Got any questions? They're really smart people, and they'll be able to answer any question that you have. And one final thought. If you're here with us and you're here investigating the Christian faith, maybe you would call yourself a religious person, or maybe you would say you're not religious at all. It doesn't really matter. But you're wondering what Christianity is about. You're wondering, what is it about Jesus? Is he just a good teacher, or is there something else? I think every Sunday when the church gathers all over the planet, there are those that come, and they've just got some real authentic questions. And so some of us on the pastoral staff, some of our elders, kind of hang around here up front at the end, and if you want to slip up here and ask a question, comment, stuff like that, we'd like to be able to hear you out, pray with you, and help if we can. So anyway, that concludes our service. Have a great week. Let's remember what this week is all about, okay? See you later.